Ben 10 has a lot of aliens. Fire aliens, ghost aliens, aliens made of diamonds. But one of them is basically a walking kaiju, and the show almost never used him. I'm talking about WAYYYYYG. He's the size of a skyscraper, shoots cosmic beams, and can literally throw giant monsters like they are action figures. So why does Ben almost never turn into him? Now, technically, both Ben 10 movies used WAYYYYG. In one way, WAYYYYG and Evil WAYYYYG had to have a Toku-style fight, and in Secrets of the Omnitrix, this was technically where WAYYYYG was first seen. I mean, airing date-wise, it actually was where we first saw him, but canonically, timeline-wise, I'm pretty sure Ken 10 is the first time we were supposed to see him. Now, WAYYYYG is a really cool alien, but apart from these three major events for original Recipe Ben 10, where clearly the creators had an idea for him to become a much bigger deal to Ben, we don't really get much of him after this. In fact, in Alien Force, WAYYYYG is locked out of the Omnitrix's reconfiguration. It's not until War of the Worlds Part 1, well into Alien Force, that WAYYYYG is re-unlocked by Master Controls. And then he fails in that episode. He only goes WAYYYYG to stop the Hybrid's hyperspace jump gate, and he fails to do that. We then see him again in Alien Force in Vengeance of Vilgax, where WAYYYYG is one of the aliens who escapes from the Omnitrix. Again, we're not really seeing WAYYYYG. We're just seeing these storylines that either lock him out or keep him away from Ben, or even when Ben does turn into him with the Master Controls, he is failing to utilize him properly. Luckily, in Alien Force, there is one storyline that uses him pretty good, which is in the storyline Simple. WAYYYYG manages to stop the war between the red and blue armies by destroying a statue in it. And I think this is like sort of an accidental kaiju stops a big war type. It feels very Toku. It feels very tokusatsu. But it felt good. I like that use of WAYYYYG. But then again, he's not used in Alien Force again until Primus, where he just does a repeat, which is he goes WAYYYYG to defeat a giant Vilgax. Now, in my opinion, coming into Ultimate Alien and Omniverse, this is where the show starts to show that it's not necessarily a perfect show. I love Ben 10, I love Alien Force, I like Ultimate Alien, and I like Omniverse, but I do think Ultimate Alien is a regression of Ben as a character, and Omniverse is a complete rewrite of his character. And that's kind of how I feel about those things. But in those shows, you do get a little bit of WAYYYYG. In the episode Video Games, WAYYYYG crushes a car. In Absolute Power Part 1, WAYYYYG defeats Gwen when they come to heads over who will take out Kevin if Gwen wants to save him, and Ben thinks that he has lost control for the last time. And then in Ben 10,000 Returns, WAYYYYG tries to destroy the Hands of Armageddon with his cosmic ray. But he was, you know, unsuccessful again. It's not necessarily just the utilization of WAYYYYG. Obviously, all the aliens are getting way more screen time than him, but every time he does come back, he's sort of underplayed. He's a really powerful alien. In The Perfect Girlfriend, WAYYYYG destroyed 2 buildings that are created by Elena. And in The Ultimate Sacrifice, WAYYYYG battles the sentient ultimate forms. But I don't think he's used quite well until the episode The Widening Gaia, where WAYYYYG fights a trash monster and throws it into the sun by creating a water vortex. I think it's a really, really good use of his powers. But here is my criticism for even this episode, where I do like the usage of WAYYYYG. It is always another giant monster. It is always another kaiju on kaiju battle. They never allow Ben to use WAYYYYG in creative ways, like he uses someone like Diamond Head or Upchuck or, you know, any of the original 10 aliens. He utilizes them in really creative ways. You will often think in Ben 10 due to the writing, oh, I never thought Ben could use that alien in that way. And WAYYYYYG is never that. WAYYYYYG is, you know, big punching machine, fine. I allow that. He is obviously a reference to Ultraman, who often is also a big punching machine and does kaiju battles. But to say that Ben can only use WAYYYYG when he has a WAYYYYG size opponent really takes away from Ben's creativity levels. It makes me think that Ben can't think of other uses of him, or Ben's not thinking straight when he turns into Humongousaur, when he clearly has free reign to just absolutely demolish someone, and there's no like buildings around them. There's often times where Ben's fighting in a desert or on an alien planet or things like that, and you know, he turns into like a Humongousaur or a Wrath or anything like that, when he could just turn into WAYYYYG and pummel. And I know people would say, hey, well, that might be lazy writing, because if he just turns into the big guy and pummels some people every now and then that's a get out of jail free card. And, well, I'm calling bullshit. Alien X, who seems to be the center focus of every time Ben can't deal with something, or the writers have written themselves into a corner, they Alien X their way out of that shit. And I'm not saying that WAYYYYG is the solution for that, but WAYYYYG could have been the solution for that a couple more times than having to rely on Alien X, who gets way less setup. They just introduced Alien X as a mysterious alien that Ben didn't know what it did until he transformed him to him once and then realized the consequences of using him. Sure, there's a power balance when it comes to Alien X, but there's not really storyline-wise. They never don't let Ben do the thing that he wants to do. And saying that there's no power imbalance with WAYYYYG would be silly. Obviously, the issue with WAYYYYG is that he can cause damage to things around him that he might not want to do. If he's in a crowded city, it is better to be Humongousaur or Four Arms, because he can use the strength without, I don't know, destroying office buildings with innocent people inside. But if he is in a barren wasteland, as he often is, he should be using WAYYYYG, and he just doesn't get enough play. So I'm just going to go over where they use him later in Ultimate Alien, so the back end of Ultimate Alien, which I'm, you know, not a massive fan of, and then in Omniverse, which of course I'm not a huge fan of. In the Ultimate Enemy Part 2, WAYYYYG goes ultimate for the very first time to battle Dagon. Now, Dagon, again, is a massive kaiju-type creature, so it makes sense for the kaiju battle sort of way that they write WAYYYYG to get him to go in. But here's another thing about this. Ultimate WAYYYYG looks way more like an Ultraman, and I do enjoy his design. He's an evolved Toku Star alien, and generally, in Ultimate WAYYYYG's favor, he does all the stuff WAYYYYG does, but, you know, he's stronger. But I don't see massive amounts of that. I really like the redesign. I really like the improved strength. The idea that he can go toe-to-toe with Dagon is a really cool thing. But this is at the end of Ultimate Alien, which again is the issue. They utilize him in the same way they utilize him in Ben 10, where they go, hey, this is a really cool thing. Let's take WAYYYYG, the guy we introduced at the end of Ben 10, to be like, this is the GOAT alien. If Ben's in real big trouble, he can go WAYYYYG, and this is gonna save him. They do that, and then immediately lock him out. And now in Ultimate Alien, they're doing the same thing, because they're going, hey, if he needs to go WAYYYYG but even stronger, he can do Ultimate WAYYYYG right at the end of Ultimate Alien. And then they switch him to Omniverse, where we're getting way more focus on newer aliens, newer storylines, and a newer Ben, where they barely use WAYYYYG at all in Omniverse. Omniverse is the longest Ben 10 show by far, and they technically only mention or use him, I believe, 6 times in the entirety of the series. They show us Ultimate WAYYYYG just to say, hey, by the way, don't worry about that. We're not gonna do anything with that. So in Omniverse, he's used in Blue Kick and Dribber Go to Mr. Smoothies, which is an episode where WAYYYYG is defeated by another alien called a Trombipula, which makes him switch out from WAYYYYG, the alien WAYYYYG, into Goop in order to defeat that alien. Now, I've got nothing against Goop. Goop is fine. Goop is a good alien. I like Goop. That is not the way WAYYYYG should be written or used. We then don't see him again until Showdown Part 2, where WAYYYYG battles Malware before being absorbed by him. Yeah, That's right, malware then gets WAYYYYYG, which honestly was about to piss me off and I was about to throw hands. But luckily, malware doesn't keep WAYYYYYG, and we do see him again in Omniverse. In fact, we see him in a two-part story called The Frogs of War, where in part 1, WAYYYYYG saves some people from a sign that he accidentally knocks over before the randomizer switches him into NRG, which again shows Ben not knowing how to use WAYYYYYG, even though he learned how to use WAYYYYYG when he was a child. And then, you know, later on, thankfully, in part 2, WAYYYYYG then battles the WAYBADs and destroys Emperor Milius's ship as WAYYYYYG, which I do think is a better usage, but you can't, in that same storyline, do the Ben doesn't know how to use WAYYYYG, then Ben knows how to use WAYYYYG so well that he uses it to defeat other WAYYYYGs. There's only 2 more left in all of Ben 10 as to where WAYYYYYG is utilized. There is the episode Universe vs. Tennyson, which actually is an episode I don't mind of Omniverse, where WAYYYYYG defeats the Trombipula by stepping on him, which makes so much more sense in comparison to the Blue Kick and Dribba Go to Mr. Smoothies episode at the start. And then finally, A New Dawn. WAYYYYYG appears for a short time when Ben's cycling through his aliens. It doesn't actually transform into him. It's just a way of saying, hey, WAYYYYYG's still around, still one of Ben's, and it's the final episode of the 8th season, and he is still in the watch, and he is still there, ready to be used. But that's it. That's the adventures of WAYYYYYG, one of the most iconic aliens in all of Ben 10, utilized a handful of times in each iteration of Ben 10, barely at all, only at the end in Ben 10, somewhat in Alien Force, but you can count it on your hand, a little bit more in Ultimate Alien, but not a great usage of WAYYYYG, and then in Omniverse, basically never for the amount of seasons it has. He is used 6 times in 8 seasons. That is awful. And he's not even used 6 times, sorry. He's used 5 times and spoken about 6. So, I mean, it is a really big waste of such a great character. My main issue with it is you show him as a kid, unlock this absolute new generational alien, and then you take him into the new generation, and then you tell everybody, hey, Ben doesn't use this alien in this generation. And when he finally does use that alien, he fails. It really feels like another FU to the Ben 10 Classic fans, I think. And I do think that he is not handled well throughout the rest of the show. But those are my thoughts. Maybe you think something else. Anyway, I have been YYYYYY. Please like, comment, subscribe, and peace.